What is propaganda? Obviously, I made up the term to make a point, so let me begin with an illustration by means of personal anecdote. As professor of film for a third of a century, and as a devoted fan for a somewhat longer period of time, I've seen thousands of movies, many several times and of different styles, subjects, levels of cultural sophistication, and from many different countries and time periods. Although many films represent a popular art form, primarily intended for an immediate period of exhibition lasting less than a year, except as a way of monitoring the current cultural climate, I do not privilege recently released movies over the many others that are available to view. Quite the contrary, at any given time, there are several movies that I would rather see than any one of the crop currently being promoted. When people meet me after "What do you do for a living?" they often ask one of two questions. What is your favorite movie? The answer to which almost always disappoints them, or something like, have you seen Guardians of the Galaxy 3 yet? To which I tactfully answer, not yet. Their discomfort with my answer invariably leads them to try to give me another chance to redeem myself by throwing out the names of a couple of similar recent releases. Now, in the interest of seeming like a regular guy and not tainting my rapport with the present audience, let me say that I usually do pass the test by managing to say something convincingly familiar enough to give the impression, at least, that I have seen and given some thought to at least one of the movies mentioned. But when I do go 0 for 3, the verdict is usually something like, how can you teach film if you don't see any? Of course, we all know about the new media that have made it possible, indeed remarkably convenient, to take advantage of the broad selection to which I and others are accustomed. Just about anyone at just about any time can see just about any movie that has not been allowed to physically deteriorate. The competition between formats is intense, and the selection grows wider. But what I wish that I could share with you is a sense of what it was like before VCRs and pay-per-view channels, to be able to choose and exhibit unusual movies to audiences on celluloid. In addition to the general sense of a movie showing as a special public event, I think you'd be impressed by the lengths to which individuals would go in order to see a movie they had barely ever heard of. An uncomfortable cultural comparison can be made, I think, with contemporary North Koreans who literally risk their lives just to see something different on television. That an appreciation of variety and quality in an art form is inversely related to its availability is nowhere better illustrated than by the example of music. Until the 20th century, if you wanted to hear music, you either had to get someone to play it for you or you had to play it yourself. Recording and broadcasting did much not only to spread acquaintance with many pre-existing forms of music, they spawned a whole new kind, the popular. In the anarchy of its early existence especially, popular music has drawn upon and even served to encourage familiarity with a great variety of other musical forms. But in the long run, do the media that have fostered popular music serve to broaden or to narrow taste in music? As in the case of movies, just about anyone at any time can listen to just about any type of music from any period or culture that is presently known. Yet consistently, all of this music, except for a relatively small number of pieces from a rather desiccated range of commercial options, accounts for less than 1% of the market. These are examples of Popaganda, a kind of propaganda of pure popularity. If, following Jacques Ellul, propaganda differs from communication in that it forsakes understanding for action, propaganda is indifferent to cultural content except to the extent that it leads to a purchase, or at least to the formation of and participation in an audience and a market. Once consumed, its meaning has less to do with literate, individualist notions of artistic significance than with what consumers do with the propagandistic product. and such doing serves to actively perform collective rituals of group belonging and identity. Semantic content, rather than being read in the individual work, is enacted socially. The differences between literate individual reading of message content and oral communal uses of propagandistic media is a major theme in the study of the role of print and other media in the early Protestant movement. In his Reformation and the Culture of Persuasion, Andrew Pedigree points out that the decision to adhere to the Reformation was often a painful one that involved embracing novelty in an era that despised and distrusted innovation and validated all change by its compatibility with inherited wisdom, custom, and teaching of the ages. What is more, with the Reformation, the process of evangelical awakening became not just an acceptance of salvation, but also a choice of loyalties, a choice articulated in terms of conversion. For the first generation of reformers, he says that there is ample evidence that the choice to convert was an individual and conscious one based on explicit understanding of competing doctrines. But as the churches of the Reformation became institutionalized, it became possible to adhere to Protestantism with little real choice and without any real mental engagement. Instead, a set of practices that I would classify as propagandistic played to what he calls a new dialectic of belonging and rejection. Taking up the question of the role of different media by which the Reformation message was communicated and imbibed, Pedigree begins with a discussion of Elizabeth Eisenstein's The Printing Press as an agent of change, as the source of a tendency to associate the printed book with a certain type of consciousness and also with Protestantism, and thus to connect the latter two uncritically. And by elevating the book in this way as a primary instrument of change, he claims, we are promoting a view of reading that is essentially modern and academic and unsuited to a culture of persuasion in the 16th century that was based on the assumption that decisions would be arrived at collectively. And so he devotes his study to relocate the book as part of a broader range of modes of persuasion that used every medium of discourse and communication familiar to pre-industrial society. Much of Pedigree's study is a re-examination of the findings of another work about popular propaganda for the German Reformation that begins with an explicit critique of the McLuhanist aphorism that the Reformation marked a shift from an image culture to a word culture, Robert Scribner's For the Sake of Simple Folk. Remarking that academic historians have had a kind of visual blind spot when it comes to images, he asserts that any knowledge of the culture and daily life of the 16th century showed that images had not been displaced from the experience of most people at that time. Reflection on the different media in which the evangelical message was expressed also revealed the fallacy of the assumption that print was the major means of transmitting ideas or forming opinions. The profoundly oral nature of the culture was inescapable. And yet he offers that McLuhan, perhaps inadvertently, supplied a key with his notion of hybridization of media, what I have elsewhere referred to as interface media. Seizing on the broadsheet as precisely such a hybrid form of print and image, his research strategy emerged, that of attempting to penetrate the visual message of the broadsheets by unraveling the language they spoke as a specifically hybrid form of communication. But while agreeing with this and much else that Scribner says in his earlier work, Pedigree questions and ultimately rejects the idea that non-literates and semi-literates were able to read or otherwise have access to tech-derived meanings of these image-based interfaced media. Apparently, interfaces between media did not adequately coincide with interfaces between social classes, as would have been the case with the largely discredited proposition that literates commonly read to and explained the meanings of complex images to their social inferiors. Instead, he explores the present participatory public uses that common people made of such interface media during the Reformation. as the sermon came more than ever to play a central role in church life during the Reformation, preaching emerged as a medium that was at once bibliocentric and intensely oral. Having developed as a system of mass communication from the 13th century onward, it was at once a personal performance, an opportunity for group participation, and especially an event of transformation. Based on outlines, models, and ultimately on scripture, actual sermons bore little resemblance to their written forms. Preachers targeted their audiences by addressing local concerns and addressing what was known as the common voice. Preaching manuals counseled the use of oral mnemonic devices and pedagogic techniques tailored to the semi-literate. The preacher himself assumed the role of the direct voice of God, while the congregation was encouraged to actively participate in the proceedings. Speaker, audience, and event were emphasized at the expense of message content, which was simplified and ambiguated to meet the needs of an interactive oral encounter. Communal singing emerged during the Reformation as the most distinctive innovation of the evangelical worship service. From the early Middle Ages on, group singing had been a pervasive part of social life pretty much everywhere but in church. Along with the increased part played by preaching, singing played to the core Protestant principle that people should be animated by an active, living faith. Luther himself had a sophisticated understanding of the musical theory and was sensitive to the capacity of music to inspire through the stimulation of emotions. One type of Protestant hymn matched scripture to contrafactor, or common tunes that could be sung to different sets of lyrics. Wedding doctrine to secular songs that people already knew served to connect church with everyday life, as well as personalize its felt meaning, unite the group, and permit a sense of active participation. The intertextuality of sacred and secular lyrics connected to a common melody served as a bridge between the two worlds. The popularity of the tunes led them to be sung in secular contexts as well as in church, and the hymnal tradition intermixed with those of the polemic song, the battle song, and the news song to produce hybrid, semantically adaptable songs suited to various forms of group activism. Though comprehension of textual content was minimal, it was a medium ideally suited to opinion formation in public places. Indeed, psalm singing served as a form of insurgent activity, often accompanied by violence and as a badge of group allegiance. Another kind of hymn, the metrical psalm, required different melodies to suit the meters of different psalms, and so could not take advantage of contrafacta. They were difficult to master, but once memorized, they facilitated a verbatim memory of Scripture. Even without the words being sung, these melodies called forth the urge to witness and a sense of the communal moment through their association with the text. But even in this case, it is the melody that makes the hymn more of an instrument of group action and identity in an atmosphere of popular politics and entertainment than of textual transmission in a purely religious context. Related to song and preaching was the drama, which had been born and nurtured in the church as both a source of religious reference and emotional inspiration. Theater developed mainly in population centers, where there was a growing sense of group awareness and communal self-expression. The mystery play, which had the longest heritage and the greatest popularity, combined the serious with the farcical and the burlesque, depicting and often inciting rowdiness and social disorder. The miracle play, devoted to the more limited subject of the life of a particular saint, left room for large doses of contemporary drama and social commentary. The morality play was most oral in its form, using characters as personifications of abstractions. Theater's evolution away from indoctrination took the form of the carnival play and the sortie, which featured the rebellious tricks of clever peasants. But the Wittenberg reformers put their faith in the humanist drama, which seemed to them to balance edification and entertainment. Plays discussed moral issues in dialogue form, similar to broadsheets, catechisms, and other proselytizing media, and the effects of these media were hoped to be mutually reinforcing. Theater, they envisioned, would bring about a synergy of the senses through an ecology of multiple media. Indeed, the plays carefully copied the iconography of paintings, prints, and other image media. But it was the live, active, present nature of theatrical performance, ironically, that most recommended it to the reformers, but also eventually led them to distance themselves from it. Most disturbing was that it led to uncontrolled activism and not just entertainment. In Bordeaux, for example, rival dramatic societies became rival gangs, which often acted as vigilante mobs. In the last resort, Pedigree concludes, drama functioned more effectively in reinforcing than in challenging communal values. It posed no real threat to the status quo. Instead, it was more suited to articulating common values in a communal setting. Along with these three interface media, Pedigree considers the uses and likely interpretations of various print and image media, as well as a number of cultural, religious, and political institutions, as so far as they acted as communication media. In an age characterized by a painful and consequential decision to adhere to one or another sect, accompanied by a profoundly alienating process of separation from much that was familiar, driven by an apocalyptic sense of urgency in an age of activist endeavor, the work of creating new loyalties and invoking new solidarities to build a new familiarity depended much more on the construction of a culture of belonging through the active, situated communal messages of an oral culture than on individual conversion through might seep through from the literate culture. For the essentials of faith were mediated, or perhaps only inferred, around the constant enactment of the religious life as sharing in a new complex of lived solidarities. That this kind of enactment could get out of control was a subject constantly on the minds of the leaders of the Reform movement. In my study of the uses of interface media in 18th century France, I found that in spite of efforts by the authorities to control them, the media of poetry, paperwork, and song were adapted to create a new kind of oppositional culture. Scholars of contemporary popular culture often speak of the appropriation of cultural commodities for oppositional ends. But like the peasant uprisings of the 16th century that were quickly and violently repressed, or the Parisian mob that fed victims to the guillotine only to be fed to it themselves, how far can a culture develop in a literate-dominated society if it lacks access to literate resources? Indeed, we are talking about more here than just the failure to appreciate Charlie Parker or Jean-Luc Godard. As Jacob Weisberg remarks in his recent review of 2 books critical of social media, Facebook encourages people to associate with those who share their views, to elevate feelings of agreement and belonging over truth, creating a giant forum for tribalism. Pursuing various forms of propagandistic connection and engagement, he says that it undermines the old fact-based information ecology in favor of a methodology that simply equates trust with popularity. That so far, the main beneficiaries of this medium seem to be the Trump campaign and various other autocratic movements should give us doubts about the role